Well, here we are at the University of Madras. This university is one of the oldest and most venerable institutions of learning. It has a Sanskrit manuscript library, one of the largest in the country. It has a department of philosophy, which includes the study of Vaishnavism and Shaivism. So today we're beginning with the conference of scholars from all over the world, and I'm looking forward to meeting them. Some of them I know already since years. This is my opportunity to ask them my main question. What is it about this book, the Bhagavata Purana, which is well over 1,000 years old, that is so interesting for and engaging for people of today, for people not just in India but all over the world? So we're going to begin today, so let's go and see what happens. Professor John Stratton Hawley is a professor of religion at Barnard College at Columbia University in New York. He's been teaching there since the last 30 years or more and researching on the Indian bhakti tradition. Bhakti, meaning devotion, is central to our subject, the Bhagavata Purana. Professor Hawley traces the various currents of the bhakti tradition as it appears in later literature, in vernacular literature, especially in the Brajabhasa language of North India, of Vrindavan, which is the home of Krishna, as described in the Bhagavata Purana. So it's very important for us that we hear from him his perspective on the effects, you can say, the reverberation, I like to say, of the Bhagavata Purana through the centuries. So nice that you're with us, Professor Hawley. Thank you for coming to this conference.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here, of course.
Maybe you could say something about what you're going to present on,
oh, Lord,
to start with.
So this is presuming I know what I'm going to present on. Yes, I'm going to speak as an outsider to this conference. Most people in the conference room are Sanskritists, yourself included. I am not, though I started in Sanskrit. So my exposure to the Bhagavata basically is the exposure of an outsider, someone whose world has been shaped by, colored by the Bhagavata for many years, but who is not, so to speak, professionally involved in the study of this great text. So I think it's called Bhagavata Without Boundaries or Across Boundaries. And it's about translations of the Bhagavata into North Indian languages, reactions to those translations, historically speaking, and in some way to give some idea of, since I'm in Vrindavan at the moment, of what it feels like to be surrounded by the performance of the Bhagavata in that place.
Performance. We could say performance is a very important element of the Bhagavata itself.
Yes.
It seems that what's happening in terms of lila or pastime can be all seen as performance, and that performance is getting re-performed in so many forms. So your focus, as I know, is especially on what has come out in the vernacular poetry of late 15th, 16th century, especially Surdas, if I'm not mistaken.
So far, so good.
And
I'm dubious about the late 15th, but 16th.
Okay, 16th.
I'm very much on board for that.
Okay. And you wrote a wonderful book some decades ago, dare I say, called Krishna the Butter Thief.
Many decades ago.
Which I've enjoyed very much, focused especially on Surdas's poetry about this particular Leela of Krishna.
And in performance, actually, we were also taking a look at the Rasa Leelas of Vrindavan and how that particular motif appears on stage. And the other thing that you've just said about performance, and you haven't quite underscored it, but I think is also true about the Bhagavata, it's a series of dialogues, actually, dialogues that are encased one in the other. Mm-hmm. So one of the interesting things that's, I think, that has happened in the performance traditions of Braj, the North Indian area where Vrindavan is located, is that those performance traditions have become less dialogical over the course of the last 40 years than they were when I first got there. As we, if you have a performance of a Bhagavat Katha or a Bhagavat Saptaha, 7 days in which the Bhagavata is expounded, it's a single performer who is doing most of that work with musical background. Whereas in the Ras Leelas, the whole thing is set up in terms of dialogue.
Right.
So in some ways, the dialogical feature, that particular aspect of performance study, you could say, has fallen victim to, I'm not quite sure what, but probably some of the other people that you'll be talking to will have some theories about that.
Okay, you're not going to venture a theory.
I won't go there quite yet.
Not yet.
But I know you'll be talking probably to Srivats Goswami, perhaps?
Yes.
Yeah, good, okay. Well, he's an interesting case because he's a Bhagavat performer himself, but he performs with his wife. So you have the samvad, the discussion actually, at least musically speaking, built into that particular performance. But he's the exception to the rule.
Very interesting. Speaking of keeping with the Damodar Leela, as it's called, the butter thief, why do you suppose this is such a popular story? From the Bhagavata, but it's endured in so many other forms.
Oh, not just endured. The Bhagavata is sort of the kernel of it.
Yeah.
But it's vastly exploded. I don't know. I attempted some answers to that question 30 or 40 years ago. I think it's partly the messiness of the story. Here you see this kid with this is butter, by the way, as you know, not butter in the sense of land of lakes as we have it in the United States. I don't know what you do in Britain. This is a very messy kind of butter. It's a liquid substance. Yeah. And the fact that it's liquid and that it can get all over him is a part of the aesthetics of the butter thief.
Yeah.
But it's only a small motif in the Bhagavata, so how do we get from there to the fact that if you buy a standard edition that's published by Gita Press today of the Bhagavatam, whose image do we see on the cover? It's not the Lord fighting the battle of the Mahabharata. It isn't someone like Ambarish. It's the butter thief. It's a crazy thing. This tiny motif in the Bhagavatam has taken on a life of its own.
Yes. What can we say about that motif as a way of representing divinity? I ask this because, I'm thinking we're presenting this to Westerners who have a notion of divinity which is very much informed by the Abrahamic traditions, and this seems to be as far away from that as you can get. And yet now this image is coming west. It's catching to some extent. What do we make of that?
Well, in my own life story, you got it exactly right. I grew up as a Protestant. And so, it was a great relief to me to encounter a religious tradition that felt that religion was at least as much about play as it was about work. This was a big relief to me. So, the butter thief, it's just play, play, play. But the other thing that's going on there, and it's going on in a childhood moment, so that's an interesting facet all its own, is, what is this butter? Well, it's, it's milk, so it's the most concentrated, viscous, interestingly spreadable form of milk. But it's milk, and what is milk? Milk is the female substance, given only under conditions of love. You have a cow who is being milked. What can you do? You can bring an effigy of a calf, and the mother cow can be persuaded to give milk. So it's all about the sort of the givenness of the world, all the sort of wonderful milk that brings us to be who we are. And then we have the Lord in the position of being the thief of that milk. What is this supposed to mean? At the very least, it's very different from Protestant notions of the religious structure of the world that I grew up with.
Indeed.
Yeah. And the parallel motif in the Bhagavatam, at least as important, is where Krishna, as a little child, starts eating, as little children will do, starts eating mud. He starts eating the dust of the earth right in front of him. And we've all seen kids doing that. And what does the mother do? She says, stop, don't do, you stay away from that stuff. And when she gets in his way, so to speak, he begins opening his mouth to her. Yes. So that she can see what he's actually eating, and you know how the story goes. Yeah. In that mouth, she sees the entire cosmos open before her eyes, coming out of the mouth of her child, and she gets quite frightened. And another motif asks him actually to close his mouth again. So in the mouth, she sees
herself,
and she sees herself. That's right.
Inside. Yes.
So what is happening in this whole drama of being involved with children? I'm not sure we know the answer, but we know that it's something cosmic.
Something cosmic. And it's some kind of turning of all relationships inside out, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yes. Now, you've also done a lot of study of what a lot of people call the Bhakti movement. And
yes, I confess.
I think maybe you do some deconstruction of that idea.
Yes, I also confess.
I sometimes tell students that there are so many streams of religion in India, Bhakti being one of them, Tantra another, and Yoga another. But if we look more closely, what do we see? We see maybe something like a delta with so many streams crisscrossing each other. And this gets even more complicated because of so many different texts. Is it fair to say, and we're not supposed to ask yes or no questions, is it fair to say that the Bhagavatam is somehow foundational to these currents of bhakti that seem to flow through the centuries after the Bhagavata?
Well, I think one of the remarkable things about the Bhagavatam is that just in terms of the three strands that you mentioned, it's a text that is argued over by people who represent in their primary orientations those three strands, and others too. The Advaitin orientation, the non-dual orientation would be still another. So the fact that the Bhagavata is argued about in those terms is, I think, a very important fact. But you were talking about the Bhakti movement, and that's another very fascinating aspect of the impact of the Bhagavata as a central text in Indian religious history. You could even argue the central text. That it has spawned a much briefer document. As you know, it's called the Bhagavata Mahatmya, a study of the glory of this text. And in that document, we have the picture of how Bhakti herself, hypostasized as a woman, moves from the south to the north. And she's rejuvenated in Vrindavan, and most people usually forget that she goes on from there to Haridwar, which is at the gate of the Himalayas. So it's a story that tells the entire geography of India while presuming to tell its significant religious history as well. I think it's very significant that that comes in the context of a document that is intended to play up the glories and the sort of power of the Bhagavata itself. So in that basic story of the Bhakti movement, which everyone knows, we have already a kind of genuflection toward the Bhagavata as a parent text. It's a remarkable thing. And it's the performance of the Bhagavata that then ends up saving some of those lost elements that you were talking about. Jnana, knowledge, vairagya, religious discipline, saves them from a life of loss.
Dharma is also a big topic in the Bhagavata.
It's in the Bhagavata, but it's not particularly in the Mahatmya.
Oh, okay. So you mentioned that the Mahatmya goes from Vrindavan then eventually to Haridwar.
On to Haridwar, but it begins in the south. That's the thing.
So it ends in Haridwar. Is that to indicate jnana is,
well, it may well
important,
be.
or yoga?
Well, I don't know. Certainly both jnana and yoga come to life as we get there, but it takes bhakti to bring them to life according to the point of view of the writer of the Bhagavata Mahatmya.
Yeah.
And by the way, it turns out to be a relatively recent text.
Yes.
Beginning of the 18th century, that's right. And we're here in Chennai, actually. It was in Chennai that I came to talk with the people at the Catalogus Catalogorum. Shanidada Das will actually be at our conference. And that document, which has been tended by Madras University over the years, is one of the fundamental places for trying to, for Sanskrit documents in particular, trying to find out how old things are, how they're spread around the subcontinent. An enormously helpful resource. So we're actually in the building where that work was done for many, many years and continues to be done.
Very good.
We were talking about Vrindavan a few moments ago. So I've had the good fortune to be back in Vrindavan for the last 3 months. I've traveled some, but I've been there a lot. And one of the amazing things that one sees as one goes around Vrindavan these days is that there are posters just everywhere. Big, big illustrated posters. And they're about various things. Billboards, that's right. Billboards. They're about various things. There's about real estate that you should buy because the price of land is just skyrocketing in Vrindavan. It could be about real estate. Could be about, you know, the kinds of medicines that you should buy. Patanjali, please. But very likely, more than anything else, and it could be about politics, but more than anything else, you're going to see huge billboards that are about the Bhagavata, about the performing of the Bhagavata Purana in 7 days. It's just amazing. So what do we make of that? Does a Bhagavata performer have to demonstrate his or her bona fides by appearing in Vrindavan so as to perform the text there where it, you know, where it's heading according to the story of the Bhagavata Mahatmya? What is it about? In any case, it's just everywhere these days. And when I came there 40 years ago, nothing.
Yeah, I had the same experience. It seems like everyone is jumping on the bandwagon, in effect.
Including yourself, if I may say so.
Oh?
Well, look at this conference.
Yes, you can take it that way, I suppose.
It's not a bad bandwagon.
No, it's not a bad.
Lots of music
if
there.
You're going to have a bandwagon, make it about the Bhagavata.
There you are.
Yes. I want to ask another question about Surdas.
Okay.
He doesn't only speak about Krishna the butter thief. He also speaks of Krishna in other activities.
Absolutely.
Such as, can you say something?
Oh, it goes all the way through his, all the episodes of the Mahabharata are there as well.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Absolutely, where there is sort of Bhishma waiting for his death at the good grace of Krishna. Oh, it's definitely there. There's a Ramayana inside the Sursagar. And there are many, many poems where he speaks, so to speak, as himself. So one of the interesting things that has happened to the Sursagar is that it's become the text of the child Krishna from many people's points of view. And that it has become a vernacular version, a translation of the Bhagavad itself, which it surely was not.
Through its accumulation of poems, probably not from Surdas.
I'm sure that's true, but also through some very heavy editorial work. Someone decided at a certain point in the late 18th or early 19th century that the Sursagar was so important that it ought to be seen as a Bhagavata. And at that point, you have a division of the text on the part of editors into 12 skandhas, into 12 books. Then you had the problem of the fact that the Sursagar doesn't actually have very much in it that would be appropriate to the 4th or the 5th book. So one had to create those poems on the spot. And you even have poems which will explain how it was that Surdas got the message through Shuka and others. So it's a fascinating process, not just in our period, but also 200 years ago, whereby the Bhagavata had become so important in the Sanskrit-based consciousness of Indian religiosity, that the Sursagar, as a vernacular document, as a Brijbhasha document, had to be aligned in such a way that it would speak the Bhagavata, even though it didn't seem to be speaking the Bhagavata at all.
And so the authority of the Bhagavata goes in that direction, but then the Sursagar becomes a work in itself of authority, which in effect brings people who go to the Bhagavat Saptaha with particular expectations.
Absolutely true.
And then Bhagavata performers performing accordingly, I suppose.
Absolutely true, which takes us back to the butter thief. But I think an important point that you've made there is that Surdas, as the great poet of Brijbhasha, which is the region where Krishna, you know, chose to live, so Brijbhasha is his language in a way that even Sanskrit is not, you could say. Surdas, as the great poet of Brijbhasha, then lends credibility to the Bhagavata as the text you have to know.
Right.
That's also what's happening when the Sursagar is refashioned as if it were the Bhagavata. It's a sort of mutual, it's a what do we call that in English? It's staying in the loop. It's a looping process. It's
looping,
it mutually reinforces. It goes back and forth between the vernacular and the Sanskrit.
Would you have any thoughts about the fact that the Bhagavata, and let's say broadly taken, but in particular the Bhagavata text, has migrated not only well, out of India to the West, to Russia. There's now an edition in Chinese. Do you have any thoughts about this? What is this? What to think about this?
Yeah. I can only tell you this, I guess, that not specifically about the Bhagavata, but one of the very striking facts of being in Vrindavan these days is there's a very noticeable community of ISKCON devotees who are from Russia.
From Russia.
And who live in places called, you know, Ruski Dom, the first one, or Ruski Dom, the second one. And then there are a few other places too. So, you know, Russians, busy passing out the Bhagavata through the eyes of Prabhupada, of course, and seeing it being translated back into Brijbhasha. So you have this wonderful scene where these Russians are dancing on the street, trying to get people to buy, to give a donation for some text that has something to do with Prabhupada's teaching, and it might be the Bhagavata itself. And some of those, very recently, are actually in Hindi. So you have this wonderful Leela whereby the Russians, who got their Bhagavata from English, actually, where Prabhupada first worked on it in the United States, Russians are bringing it back into Hindi. A fascinating process.
Another loop.
Total loop, exactly. Everything is all interactive in some way.
Is that something like the fact that Mohandas Mahatma Gandhi first encountered Bhagavad Gita in England in an English translation?
I'm sure it is. I'm sure it is.
It's all part of that same
story.
Absolutely,
absolutely. No, the Leela of the world these days, oh my God. Let's not talk about it too much because the play has gotten a little out of hand in the American elections, but that it is mysterious.
Let's not
go there. That it is mysterious and play-like. At the very least, we have that.
Indeed. Could you say a little about, to change the subject slightly, Dennis Hudson and his work with the Vaikuntha Perumal Temple?
I'll say a word. We both knew Dennis. He was a very close friend. And his idea was this, in a sentence, I guess, that one could make sense of this very important 8th century temple in Kanchipuram, where I hear you're going tomorrow, make sense of the temple of Vaikuntha Perumal if one understood the sequence of stories in the Bhagavata. And that this was a temple that tried to do two things. It documented, in a satisfying way, in this temple structure, it documented the religious history of the dynasty that it served.
Through bas relief.
Absolutely. Reliefs on the side of the temple itself. But at the same time, it achieved that purpose by telling the story of the Bhagavata at the same time. So I'll be very curious. I hope you're taking Dennis's guidebook along with you. Be very curious to know what you make of what you see on the temple itself, and you may have been there before, indeed.
I was there once, very briefly, late evening. I didn't have time to really look at it. But yes.
One of the things that often happens to people is they arrive late evening and have to go back. Now you're going back. It's a good thing.
Yes, we have to go back. Huh? Right now we're approaching Kanchipuram, which is about 2 hours drive outside of Chennai. We're heading for the Vaikuntha Perumal Temple, where we want to do some interviewing of a couple of our scholars. I visited this temple a couple of years ago, very briefly, and I had heard about it quite some time before that. It's an important place in connection with the Bhagavata Purana. This temple is a kind of three-dimensional Srimad Bhagavatam in sculpture. So we're quite excited to finally get the opportunity to come here and to see some of this work which was done. The original temple was completed at the end of the 8th century. So we're looking at a place which is some 1,200 years old as a monument in stone to the literature, the text, which we are interested in.